The passage of Scripture this morning is from 139th Psalm, and it says all the Psalm, but actually we're going to stop at the 14th verse. So if you want to follow along, you're welcome to do so, but we'll stop at verse 14. O Lord, you have searched me and known me. You know when I sit down and when I rise up. You discern my thoughts from far away. You search out my path and my lying down, and are acquainted with all my ways. Even before a word is on my tongue, O Lord, you know it completely. You hem me in, behind and before, and lay your hand upon me. Such knowledge is too wonderful for me. It is so high that I cannot attain it. Where can I go from your spirit? Or where can I flee from your presence? If I make my bed in Sheol, you are there. If I take the wings of the morning and settle at the farthest limits of the sea, even there your hand shall lead me, and your right hand shall hold me fast. If I say, surely the darkness shall cover me, and the light around me become night, even the darkness is not dark to you. The night is as bright as day, for darkness is as light to you. For it was you who formed me in my inward parts. You knit me together in my mother's womb. I praise you, for I am fearfully and wonderfully made. Wonderful are your works that I know very well. May God add his own blessing to the reading and hearing of his holy word. Well, here's a passage that tells us a little bit about God's interest in us, his compassion for us, his care, his knowledge of us. Knowledge. It says in there 7 times, if you go through the whole psalm, 7 times it talks about God knowing us, how well he knows us, everything we do, everything that we think, everything that we say. God knows all of that. Even to the point, it says, of hemming us in. Now, that may sound a little containing, but that's not what they're talking about. They're talking about, we hear the phrase hedge of protection that comes from Scripture passages. We're talking about being kind of made safe, and with God's hand covering us, that nothing can harm us. That very tremendous sense of protection. And that kind of feels good, doesn't it? When you think about it? I mean, isn't it nice to be known by somebody? To be really known, to have someone be so interested in you that they actually know who you are. And I think children often, in that sense, it relates to me in that way with when you see a child that's very young, 2, 3, 4 years old, everything in their world really revolves back to the parents. And I can remember raising kids at that age and enjoying seeing them come if they need something fixed. They go to mom or dad, right? If they've hurt themselves in some way, they go to mom or dad, right? There's that they seek that protection. There's a sense of trust in that place, and that's a pretty good thing. There's a sense of comfort in knowing that we are protected. We all saw the news about yesterday's scare in Hawaii, where the missile report came out that said there was a ballistic missile coming in. Hawaii has about 13 minutes from North Korea to prepare. And the message said, seek shelter. Not sure that would make much difference. Now that caught my attention, and I thought that was a little bit of news, and thought about people who were there, and then found out this morning that my brother was there at the time. He was with some students from Washington University leading a geological study of some kind, and so I managed to get a hold of him this morning and ask by text, but I just learned you were there, and can't imagine what that must have been like. He said, "You got to know my brother." He said, "I figured it was a mistake." There's 2 things about my brother that you got to know. One is he could be exactly right. He really might have thought that. And 2, if he didn't think that, that's what he would have said, because that's how he is. But at any rate, he said some of the students were just terrified. They thought it was all over. In those moments, we do want that protection. In those moments, we're really happy to have a God who is able to really care for us beyond these kind of crude fixings that we live in right now. Malia talked about with the children. We hope that we're going to be bound for glory. Not her phrase, but we know that one. That we hope that we have that place in heaven. That kind of protection is very comforting. And more than that, I mean, for those who truly put our faith into that and really accept that, very little else has a real hold of us in terms of making us afraid. But children, if you watch them as they get older, sometimes that sense of trust, that absolute sense of dependence begins to go away, doesn't it? As they begin to find some independence and they begin to realize that they have their own lives and they're not so much joined to their parents, and it's a natural part of it growing up. As they get older and realize that they have their own responsibilities for things and realize that sometimes we don't get everything right, then we see kids who sometimes don't want their parents to know everything, don't we? Right? I was in high school, believe it or not, years ago. They had high schools in my day. And I was in the high school. And I was in high school in the days where you could get spanked. And it happened to me one time. One time. I didn't think it was fair. Right? What someone say, there's nobody guilty in prison if you ask the prisoners. It was study hall, and we were supposed to be we had to be absolutely silent. Whatever you were doing, you had to be absolutely silent. You're supposed to study or take a nap, but that was it. And my friend and I were being absolutely silent, but we were sitting across the table from each other. We were playing paper football. So that wasn't studying or taking a nap, even though we weren't making any noise. So the coach, who was the one running study hall, which was in the cafeteria, so he had scads of people in there. And he just pointed at my friend and me, and he just did his finger like that and said, "Come with me." And we were taken directly to the principal's office. No warning. No, stop that or else. It was just, come on. And so we got there, and we were given a choice. You can get 2 licks with the board. I'm talking about boards about 1 inch thick. And you could get 2 licks with that, or we could have our parents called. That's a tough choice. I'm not very smart. I took the 2 licks and then told my parents about it later. But we do get to that point. Aren't there things we don't want our folks to know? And when we look at the middle, the end of it's kind of the middle of the psalm, but the last part that we read, where can I go from your spirit? Everywhere that I go, you're there. You're even in the depths of Sheol, kind of a concept of the ancient Hebrews of hell. If I go to the farthest ends of the sea, they kind of had a flat earth thing going back in that day, and the ends of the sea was the end of everything. The furthest you can imagine, anywhere that you could go. God was more present than Santa Claus. Anywhere that you could go, anything that you could do, God knows all of it. Does that ever make us nervous? You ever look at it that way? Are there things that you really kind of wish even God didn't know about you? Some of your secret thoughts, some of your wishes, some of the fears that you might have, some of what you think about another person, some of what you think about yourself. We all have those moments in those places where we don't want anybody to know that that's a part of us. And maybe especially we don't want God to know. And that tends to separate us from God. Not the thought, not the act that may be there, sins of omission or commission. The idea that God would be disappointed, or the fear that God would be angry. So sometimes we actually pretend like God doesn't know. And we sometimes do that by pretending that we don't know. We kind of ignore the inner self, the part of it that we're uncomfortable with, that we don't like, that we don't want to admit to. We hope if we bury it, either it'll go away or it'll never surface and no one will know about it. And we won't even know about it. We fool ourselves into that sometimes. But God does know. He does know. And what's more, even though he knows, he still loves. Even though he knows, he still loves. He made us in a fearful and wonderful way, the psalm says. The passages of Scripture, the stories of Scripture have some people that I love to remember. People like Paul, who used to be Saul. People who, Paul, here's a person who persecuted the Christians. He did his best to see that that Jesus' followers were wiped off the face of the earth, even to the point of helping them be stoned and executed. And God knew that. And at one point, God confronted him. Remember the story as Saul was on the road to Damascus, and he hears the voice of Jesus saying, "Why do you persecute me?" And despite that, he is called to a different ministry by the very one he persecutes, and serves him with his full life in every way possible. There's Peter, the disciple, the one who denied Jesus 3 times, who said 3 times on the night Jesus was at trial, "I have no idea who that is." The time when Jesus needed him most, Peter abandoned him. So they have a breakfast later on. The story goes in the book of John, and after Jesus has been resurrected, and Jesus talks to Peter and says, "Do you love me?" And 3 times he asks him, "Do you love me?" Just like 3 times Peter denied. And Peter never answers it quite the right way. If you read through the detail of that story, he never really answers Jesus the way Jesus wants to be answered. And yet still Jesus says, "Follow me." Anyway. Just remember that word, anyway. Then there's David in the Old Testament. David, the king, who got involved with Bathsheba, the wife of another man, and ended up having a child with her, and he ended up setting up the army so that her husband Uriah was killed in battle. That's pretty deep stuff there, isn't it? And yet God calls David a man after his own heart because David continually tried to be faithful despite his weaknesses. Let's not make excuses for his weaknesses. Let's acknowledge his desire to be faithful, his desire to stay with God and to be known by God. Matthew was a tax collector. Tax collectors were essentially traitors to their people. They collected for the enemy. The Romans who occupied Judah were the enemy of the people. They were a foreign army occupying their country. And the tax collector collected taxes for the enemy. Jesus called Matthew to be a disciple. Anyway. And then, of course, you've got Zacchaeus, another tax collector, who, after meeting with Jesus, promised to give back more than he had taken from people in taxes. Jesus called him into the fold of believers anyway. Anyway, today is about anyway. It's about how I fit into God's kingdom anyway. How about how you fit into God's kingdom anyway? Who is it that really can stand before God with the knowledge that we have met his every expectation? Even Job, who had never really done anything wrong, had truly been faithful. There was a flaw in Job that required God's grace before his life was restored after all the trouble he had. God cares about us anyway. He knows us. You want to try to hide from God the faults, the weaknesses, the mistakes, the dark thoughts, the dark places? He knows them anyway. And yet he still looks to us and says, "I want you to be a part of my kingdom, a part of my family anyway." It's not just God being nice to us and giving us a little help when we need it. Through Jesus and the ministry that he had and the gift of death and resurrection, he gives us life. And Paul says it's not just life. He adopts us into his family. We become brothers and sisters of Christ, children of God. Children of God. What does it mean to you to have someone in your family that you care about, that you devote yourselves to, who may have made mistakes and done some things you weren't happy about, didn't like, but you love them anyway. And they have a place anyway. Today is about our place with God anyway. Now, God doesn't just hand out free passes. You go, wait, I thought he did. They're available. We have to accept it. It's not a trick. It's not a bargain. We have the free will, the choice to refuse it. That's all I mean by that. Grace is not cheap. It was paid for by Christ. And when we accept it, we take on the desire to be like Jesus. The intent to become more and more faithful. And that's what covenant is about. To renew the covenant or to make the covenant for the first time is about giving ourselves to God anyway. Of allowing him to know us fully. He knows it anyway. But acknowledging his presence within us. Letting him see. And see, when we allow God to see it, guess what that means? When we present ourselves to him, we see it too. And then we know. Then we can acknowledge, God, help me as I pray about this in my life. Forgive me as I acknowledge this in my life. Strengthen me as I acknowledge a weakness in my life.